Hello, happy Wednesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is an unrehearsed, unedited look into my workflow. I'm Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, sometimes animator, designer, and your pal. And I'm excited as always to be coming back to the table and sharing another awesome episode of creating digital art and design and illustration animation. And I'm excited to do it with you guys. So thanks for tuning in. I think straight out of the gate, I have to apologize for being a day late with this episode. There was a bit of travel yesterday that was, couldn't really get out of and was scheduled for the time that I was supposed to be streaming this show. Um, Unfortunately, by the time I actually did get home, I was going to do it a couple hours late. By the time I did get home, I was pretty exhausted, and I wanted to make sure I was well rested and in a good creative state of mind to give you guys the type of show you deserve. So, apologies for the late apologies for the late start, but glad to be back with you. I see Heron in the chat. What's up, man? Thanks for stopping by. Um, as folks are starting to queue up, I guess I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to what we're working on today. It's something a little bit different for me, but something that I think will be really useful for a lot of you folks, and a really fun exercise. We're going to be exploring some of the different like camera presets and angles, specifically like the isometric view, and how to create sort of cool bird's eye overhead views of what we're going to be creating as a cityscape today. And we can get these really cool sort of video game level or like sort of SimCity-esque views of a city and doing some simple building and landscape modeling. And we're going to have a bit of fun doing it. So as always, I think these episodes are best when folks are in the chat, saying hi, asking questions, sharing what they're working on. A little later in the episode, as we do in a lot of these shows, if you have a link to your work that you want to share with the practice community, please send a link in the chat. We'll fire that up and take a look and get more eyes in front of your work and get you a little feedback if you want it. So that being said, let us dive in. I'm going to start really simply with just modeling out some sort of buildings. Oops. And I don't want these to be super complicated because there's going to be a lot of them, and I think a nice sort of simple form will work best. What I'm also going to do to make things a little easier on myself is use what do you call them? Instances. So that way, each time we want to create a new version of this, we're not remodeling it. And right now, I got a street sweeping machine going by my house. Hopefully, that's not too loud for you. All right, so we're going to start really simply by just kind of blocking out this building. And normally I wouldn't add a ton of subdivisions, but I want to put some sort of surface details, well, some greebles, if you will, on these buildings. I think I'm going to make a few different types as well, so that we can sort of populate the city with instances. And the good thing is if we start by making a few different building types, a couple different sizes, then we'll have a whole sort of palette of things to work with as we start populating this cityscape. So let's call that building one. Let's try another building type. So I'm going to try and strike a balance here with creating the right amount of detail and not having them be overly complicated. Hey there, yeah, so I did see that tutorial request, and that's something I can look into doing. Didn't mean to ignore you there, but that's a technique that's going to probably require a little bit more thought before putting together a practice stream about it. I don't want to fumble too badly through that technique since it's one I'm not really super comfortable with and experienced with, but something I'll certainly give some thought to in the future. The other issue with that technique is also it involves a lot of processing, and you'd be running a lot of calculations over videos, which can take a long time to render and don't always make for the best live streaming experience. I know we've gotten into situations before where we're waiting for really long processing times or long renderings to kick out, and I hate for you guys all to get bored as we're just sort of sitting there watching calculations churn. So it's definitely a cool technique called motion. It's like a motion tracking technique. I know, like, if you Google Cinema 4D motion tracking, there's going to be a ton of tutorials that pop up. So something I'd like to explore in the future, but perhaps a technique that's not super conducive to a live streaming situation. So there you have it. We got two very simple building types. We should probably make some smallish sort of random houses. And I think what we're also going to do is probably work on a grid to make creating a cityscape a little bit easier on ourselves. Right. Ooh, look, the Periscope comments are in fact working. I don't think I've ever had those come through before. So someone asked, "What you doing?" Working on my grammar. No. So I'm creating a cityscape in a digital art application called Cinema 4D. Right now, we're just creating a handful of buildings that, over the course of the next approximately 2 hours, we're going to be using to create an isometric view of a cityscape. This is the early going. What you doing? Yeah. Hey, Chris. Thanks for stopping by again. Yeah, the isometric camera is awesome. It's a powerful tool. I think it's a little hidden gem that perhaps a lot of cinema users don't know about, and something that I don't play with a ton. So certainly something fun to explore this week, and hopefully a useful tidbit for you all. So what I'm doing now is just creating sort of a handful of very simple building types that I can use to populate this scene that we're going to create. Yep. Basically, yeah, I'm making little different building types. Then what I'll probably do is instead of using a cloner, I'll probably wind up just using instances. That way, if I want to go in and alter any of these, which I probably will do once we start creating that landscape, it'll be really easy to make it a change universally. And I find that, the cloner is super useful and I use it a lot, but I think I'm going to want to have a little bit more of a specific, control of where I'm placing different objects. And the cloner can be a little bit random or a little bit stiff and rigid and getting like just totally grid-like. So there you have it. This building a little bit small. All right, we can always add building types from here. What I'm going to do is establish a ground quickly, which I'm going to do with a landscape. That's a great way to get some fairly natural looking ground with a little bit of roughness to it, which looks great. What I might also do is actually maybe create some like little plateaus. Maybe this city's up on a hill. What we can do here is we can adjust the plateau level a bit, get those borders back at sea level. What we can do is create sort of a flat plateau. You can see here how we're starting to get a flat spot on this landscape already. Use the poly count on that just a hair. Hello, Matthew Buskirk, new viewer. Thanks for stopping by. There's a lot of programs I probably should be using, but I don't. Are you a Maya user? All right. So early in the video, we discussed wanting to set up an isometric camera angle, which is fairly easy to do. And while I'm doing that, I want to share briefly some of the other camera settings that come with Cinema. So you can see I created a camera. Hit this little button to get inside the camera. Hit that camera view. Then I'm going to go to Display. Nope. I'm going to Camera, Axonometric, and I'm going to go to Isometric. You see what that does is it creates a camera that you can't actually rotate. It's from a fixed perspective, right? And what I should say is it's actually not truly a perspective camera because what you can see is that these grid lines remain parallel. Now it happens in typical perspective views is that as the grid lines go into the distance, they will start getting closer to each other, and that's the illusion of perspective, right? What an isometric camera does is it forces all of those lines to be parallel at all times. And as you can see, there is no sort of converging lines into the horizon. We've got a nice even perspective, and everything remains really consistent in a grid-like pattern, and all the lines remain parallel with each other, which it gives you that really cool sort of video game SimCity look, and it's something that I'd like to explore a little more, and it is a super useful tool. Hey Source, thanks for stopping by again. Like I was saying earlier, we are making an isometric cityscape, and just chatting now briefly about some of these axonometric cameras that come in cinema. Isometric's only one of them. There's dimetric, which is a slightly lower camera angle, and then there's military, which is kind of an odd one. It feels really stretched and forced. I'm sure each of these could have their different uses. A gentleman is sort of a human scale perspective. Bird, obviously bird's eye, a little bit higher. And then the last is frog, which is a really odd one. It's a lot like bird's eye. I'm not sure exactly where it gets the name frog. I assume it's meant to be sort of a like a worm's eye view is what I've heard of before. If there's a bird's eye view, there's also a worm's eye view, which is low and looking up. But for me, for this scene, and what I think is typically most useful is this isometric view, which doesn't distort things too much because it's that great sort of overhead view. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Yeah, right, Chris? The frog one's super weird. But yeah, there we have it. All right, so what I'm going to do is, since we got this great camera, we got this camera angle now, and we're starting to establish sort of a landscape. I want to get the composition started, figure out this camera angle, and then we're going to start populating with little buildings. I think some of these are too big already. Each of these groups, these buildings, I'm going to move our little widget down so it's at the base, which I think is going to make it a little bit easier to work with. Cool. All right. What I also want to do is create maybe some high points and some low points in different areas. Maybe there's a hill over here. So as always, in the early going, we're sort of blocking the scene out and get things to look right. Get the composition popping. That is frequently the most important part of any scene. Be the composition, making sure that looks great. I also think we might make this a square format image. I'm going to make that adjustment now, because doing that later, when we've got our composition working well, it'll make things harder on us. We're going to have to make more adjustments, right? So I'm going to start with this. I think I'm also going to do is use these grid lines in the landscape as sort of a guide for where to place things. And since this is an outdoor scene, physical sky is going to be a perfect way to light it. So create some groups here. Buildings, landscape. Notice one thing I like to do as well is in the hierarchy, I like to have the I like to keep the lighting all the way at the bottom, the geometry at the top, and I use the camera as a little divider between the two. And you don't have to work that way, but I would recommend organizing this object manager in a consistent way across your projects because it reduces the amount of time that you need to sort of look around for things. The less time you spend clicking around, the more time you can spend sort of creating. So there we have it. Let's start with a fairly basic texture for the ground. Kill that reflectance channel. There should be a little lake someplace, a little pond or something. Let's find a low area, a landscape. Oh, come on. Oops. I'm just sort of going through the seed, seeing if there's a landscape that's going to fit what we're trying to do here well. If not, I might just modify this thing, expand it, and push the pixels around in a way that I need them. See, this one looks pretty good. A little bit of water happening right in the middle here. Whoops. You guys are lucky enough to have a waterfront property, which is cool. And so for each of these, instead of making actual copies of the geometry, I'm going to just use instances, which is going to make it a lot easier on us ultimately. I'm going to keep them grouped by type. Keep all those instances in a little null object along with the others. I want to have some of the smaller buildings up here in the hill. Trying to keep my object manager fairly organized here. Bring this in just a little more. All right, so let's do a little test rendering here. Let's see what we got. Fairly basic already, obviously. Let's add a little ambient occlusion. But it's a good start. I want to add a little bit more interest to these landscapes here, and a little bit more color, I think. You see, I just adjusted the timing on this physical sky, and it's changing the way the lighting's hitting this scene. I kind of like these shadows. I like those nice, cool blue shadows we get, but I think the direction of the shadows isn't quite right for the composition. I'm just rotating this sky, and that's going to change the angle of the sun, of course. Ha! Golden hour button on the sun. Like, I totally hear you, man. In fact, a lot of times the reason I use it is because I can sort of get those effects, right? Even if you have to go in and make the sun a little oranger yourself and all that good stuff. But the later the day, or if you go into this physical sky and rotate this clock so it's a little bit later in the day, you're going to get a little bit more of those long afternoon shadows and a little bit more of that sort of golden hour look, which I think always looks awesome. So I think now really let's start getting these buildings going. We'll probably want to add a few roads and things like that too. So, get an instance of this guy. Now, unfortunately, you cannot scale an instance directly with the scale tool. If you come into the coordinates and adjust the scale parameters, you can, which can be useful. Because if I adjust the scale of this building 3 object, just scaling it down, you can see the instance will scale down as well, which is fine in this instance actually because I want both a little smaller. Source, just reading through your questions now, man. That's a good question. Now, what I think, like, so I can't really answer that for you. I'm not sure about the markets, to be honest. Of course, I don't want more competitors, right? No, but honestly, I think you need take a moment, think about where you want to be, think about what your objectives and your goals are, and think about which is going to help you get closer to those, right? So I can't answer that directly for you. Um, I mean, there's a lot of pressure in streaming your work. You feel the need to make it come out really strong each time, and if you're not super experienced, or if you're not up to the challenge of sort of doing it live all the time, then perhaps it's better to just do an everyday, because that way you can scrap it and try again. The other benefit of an everyday is that you can, when things get a little bit tight, timing wise, you can, make a few extras some other time and sort of insert them into your everyday stream, sort of a backup. Make extras, and maybe you get the time one day to make 2 at a time if you've got an extra hour or two, and then sort of put that in the can and use it again at some point in the future. I imagine Beeple and those guys do that. I doubt he's done it really every day for 10 years. I think it's probably been more of a, most days, and then every once in a while you make a couple in one day and use those when you've got a vacation coming up or whatever it might be. Again, that's speculation. I don't know that for sure. But here I am blathering on and on. And I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but I would say before you start doing anything, don't just do what everyone else is doing because it seems like that's the way to success. I would encourage you to think about where you want to be and what your goals are, and try and make decisions that will bring you closer to that end. Hopefully that helps and makes sense. Definitely not throwing shade on people. He is a killer and a big inspiration for a lot of people in the industry. I just think that, he must have taken a day off here or there, even though his Instagram account doesn't necessarily reflect that. And if not, if I'm wrong, then even more props to him. Guy's an animal. So if the main goal is to make your work as strong as possible, I would probably say don't stream. I would say just make stuff without the pressure of having to do it live in front of people. I mean, unless that pressure doesn't bother you, unless you think that pressure might help elevate your work, in which case, go for it. But if you're still a student, I would recommend maybe an everyday. And even if you don't feel like committing to an everyday, just be consistent and diligent and get in there and keep making stuff. That's really what's going to make it happen. I think a lot of times people get caught up in whether or not it should be an everyday or a weekly or a stream, and a lot of that stuff is good, but it can be a lot of additional pressure. It can be a little bit more informal. Just make stuff all the time. Oops. Accidentally just hit S, which zoomed in on the selected object. So what I'm going to do here is add a protection tag to this camera so I'm not moving it around accidentally and messing up the composition. I threw on shade on people. It's so funny. I think it's interesting. Like, going back to people, I'm not sure that people really overthinks it. I think he just got the idea to make tons of work, and for him that took the shape of an everyday, and he's just been cranking them out since. And his everydays when he first started out, they weren't all in 3D either. He was making After Effects projects and doing stuff in Illustrator. Um, and I think the whole everyday just came from the desire to consistently put out lots of good work, right? And he sort of, in a lot of ways, popularized and brought the whole idea of the everyday to the mainstream, certainly for 3D artists. But to be honest, I don't think he overthought it. He's just making stuff because he likes to. So maybe now start getting a little bit of a road going on. So I'm going to copy this, expand it, start making selections. Oops. That's a sloppy ass road, huh? Going right over that water because that might function as our bridge there. So let's see here. Oops, that's not it, certainly. Whoops. Instead of just extruding, which you can see as I get out of this perspective, right? So we've got an uneven surface that we're extruding from, and that's going to give us a really wonky edge. So what I'm going to do is do a tiny little extrusion, which is going to give us slightly less wonky edge. And I'm going to scale it up, or excuse me, move it up just with the arrow keys. I'm going to use the scale tool to flatten it out. See what I did there? Just dragged the horizontal or the vertical scale down to 0. And that just sort of flattens it out. And now we've got the bottom hugging the the contours of the landscape. We've got a nice flat top. So I'm going to drop this guy a little bit low. And then this guy, kind of like our bridge sort of highway deal now. Let's see how that looks. What I might do, let's see here. Oops. Looks like I missed some things on that atom array. So I'm going to alter this a little bit. I'm going to get rid of this bridge. Keep the atom array. Take all of this piece, both sides. Use that, put that back inside the atom array, since it'll match more closely the geometry that I need. Let's isolate it. Make sure I have an even selection on both sides, which looks good. Going to copy that into the grid, to the atom array, select the inverse, whoops. Select the inverse, delete those. Whoa, not that. Nope. Select all in polygon selection, hold shift, knock that over to point selection mode, UI to select the inverse and delete. There we go. And here, oops, go back to that polygon selection and just delete these. Okay, cool. Now we've got something that's starting to look like a bridge. Okay. Let's see how that looks. Turned on angle limit. For whatever reason, that angle limit wasn't on. That's probably because we were dealing with a landscape and not a typical cube. This looks like a rounded road, so that's going to sharpen that road up a little bit. And now let's make some cross streets, yeah? So do the same technique. A little less complicated because we're not going to be making them into a bridge, but... I think the shadowing is a little bit too dense. And I'm going to leave it for now, but I think what I'll probably wind up doing is turning on global illumination, or at least the physical renderer, a little bit later. because that's going to add a ton to the render times, of course. But I think it might be worthwhile. These guys are going to need roads up here too. But I'm not sure the best way to connect them down to the main landscape is yet. I'll figure something out. It's an interesting suggestion, Source, and I will check out this link a little bit later when it's time for a longer rendering. Oh, what's going on here? Ah, that's what. Wasn't careful with my selection there, so I'm just going to sort of delete this stuff by hand. It's not the cleanest way to do it, but it'll only take a sec. Oops. Looks kind of neat, even though that's not what we want. That's weird Z fighting error. I'm going to throw a little bit of fog in this scene. See what that gets us. It's going to be an interesting way to sort of map the height of things. Certainly going to add to render times. Also bumped up the intensity of the sky in the physical sky object. So to give us a little bit more fill light. And you see the shadows aren't quite as dark. Since I turned the time back, they're not quite as long either, which I think is good. Feeling just a little bit long. Just rotating it a bit so we can control the angle of the sun. I'm not loving the way this is parallel to the edges of the buildings. I want more of an angle on that. Hi, Alexander. Thanks for stopping by. And yes, huge SimCity vibes. That's really typical of this sort of view, especially when you get the cities and the hills and stuff here. Definitely a SimCity kind of thing. Brings back fond memories for sure. These look like little Monopoly houses, actually. And what would one of my landscapes be without a handful of capsule objects, right? Yeah, I want to start mixing in a little bit more variety, some more hilltops, some smaller details into the landscape. Maybe I even need to add a couple of trees or plants or something like that. And so we got our big mountains, but we should have some little hills and some things to break up some of these flat areas. Add some interest to some of these rocky cliffs. Yeah. You know what's nice about that? That immediately adds a ton of interest is that we've got some round forms, some smooth edges that are contrasting nicely with some of the hard edges of the road and the buildings. Hmm. Hmm. See, now the benefit of using instances is now that I'm making this little adjustment and adding a little bit of roof detail, this guy, is it's going to apply to all of those guys automatically. All the other instances of this model are all going to get this same amount of detail, which helps. Let's add a few trees. Some simple pine tree kind of looking dudes. Oops. I think that we're starting to add enough detail here and interest where the scene's going to start feeling a little more satisfying. There's enough going on. I figured I needed one road to sort of connect the upper landscape to the lower. This one I can't, since it's two separate landscaped objects, I can't really connect them just with the, or it won't be a straight connection just with the single loop selection like I was doing before. I'm going to have to sort of do this by hand. It might be easier actually if I get in there. Do it like this. Might actually need to throw this in a subdivision surface too, so I can get enough geometry to really have a nice bend. Make sure. A little bit tedious, a little bit of a pain to get in here and alter all this stuff, but it could be worth it. Oops. All right, let's see what that gets us. Yeah, I'm really liking the way those trees are looking. I do think perhaps they're a little bit large though. So, great thing about having instances, I can just grab one of this main original tree, and just scale it down. Some of these guys may need to drop a little more to get into the landscape, but it's easy enough. Yeah, that scale for the trees feels much better. We may add a few more. Just adding a little bit more detail here too in terms of the landscape. Add just a little bit of sort of a rockier feel to it. Just a little bit of detail. I think we could use a little bit more range of color sort of in, especially these brown hues. All right. It's feeling nice. It's starting to come together. I'm just pasting a bit of diffusion with a noisy texture. It's going to add just a little bit of interest and detail and texture to some of these landscape areas. You can see these little noise patterns, which I think look really great. All right. So I'm going to try two things. I'm going to see what physical does for us. And then I'm going to see what GI does for us. Make a little comparison. So the lighting is pretty similar. The physical render gives us a little bit of a noisier shadow, which I don't mind. Overall, not a huge difference between the two. Obviously, of course, barring the texture changes that I made. Now, I think we're going to see a big difference when we throw on GI. So let's do that. Now that's going to take a minute to render, and while that's rendering, cool. All right, Source, yeah. And I was actually, it's too bad you're leaving now. I was just about to check out that link you shared. But you'll see, hopefully, in the replay that I did do that. So, let's see what we got here. Cool. This reminds me of some of Beeple's stuff. Oh, looks like it's still rendering, too. You got a little progress bar down here. Cool. Looks good. I'd say a little bit of feedback. I know you didn't ask for it necessarily, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. A little bit of feedback would be to focus on a focal point. Like pick a focal point and have the composition point to it and celebrate it. There's sort of a lot going on here, and while a lot of the effects are really cool, I'm just not sure where to focus my eye. So, think about that. Sonoma. That's interesting. Yeah, definitely with the hills and the bridges, and there's the bay there, so you got a little bit of water. That's actually quite close to where I'm from, or where I live now, at least, in San Francisco. I've definitely driven through there. Beautiful country. Beautiful country indeed. So thanks for sharing that, Kieran. I believe your name is Kieran. We've corresponded a few times. I know you go by Source on YouTube. Forgive me if I've forgotten your name or botched it somehow. All right. So now you can see a big difference in the quality of the lighting when you go to global illumination. You get more of a bounce. The shadows are nowhere near as heavy. What I did like, I think I like the overall lighting a bit better. But what I think we're missing is that nice blue from the shadows. So I'm going to alter that a bit. Well, actually, first I'm going to group these trees. I'm going to go to physical sky. Let's see here. So the sun, under the sun tab, I'm going to go to the shadow. I'm going to add that ton of saturation and bluishness to that. Let's see if that gets us more of that bluish kind of feel. Now you can already see in the initial bounces how it's a little bit bluer. See how that looks in the final render. This is actually, even though we've got physical turned on and GI, fairly quick render. Interestingly, not a ton of blue added to the shadows. Another thing I can do, well, I mean, and of course I'm going to color correct in Photoshop towards the end of the stream. Another thing I can do is go into ambient occlusion, right, and you can sort of select the color. So I'm going to add some blue there too. It's still very dark. You want the base to be very dark, but you can add some color in there. And wow, that's really blue now. Look at that. At least in the pre-passes. We don't know how that's going to translate to the final rendering. So it is bluer. Not quite as blue as before. But we can bump that up in Photoshop. But it is definitely bluer, which I actually really like. I want to say the one thing I'll say is this water looks a little bit flat. So I'm going to try something here. So using transparency, I'm just going to add a simple alpha. A bit of transparency. Which reminds me, you always got to do this. Go into whenever you add transparency, you got to go into ambient occlusion and click evaluate transparency. That works both for alpha and for typical transparencies. So I'm going to bring this up just a little bit. This is kind of a neat technique that I've tried a few times. Since this is see-through, I'm going to hold Command and copy a version down. I'm going to do that twice, and this might give us sort of the illusion of depth inside that pond. Going underwater here. One. Let's see. I want to sort of layer these. Oops. All right, let's try that out. Certainly going to add a bit of render time. The alpha is not as bad typically as real transparency in terms of render times. But let's see what that gets us. Hopefully a little bit more of a watery kind of look with a little bit of depth. Because that water is looking just a bit flat. Yeah, Chris, totally. Right? You get that dark, kind of ugly shadow. Go back to an old project and just tick that box and see how much of an improvement you're going to get. You're going to get a much more realistic, transparent, glassy sort of look. You know, I used to use transparency every time I wanted to get, you know, a see-through look. But I've been using alpha a lot more recently, and you can't use refractions, unfortunately, with alpha. It's a simple it's a simple alpha process. It's not a full like reflective, transparent process, but the render times are a lot faster. It can still give you some nice results. So, all right. So I don't see much of a difference at all in the water. So I think what I need to do is turn the alpha up a bit, make it a bit more see-through. See what that gets us. So yeah, definitely affecting render times. Hmm. Just not really able to see any of the layering here. Just a bit, actually. You see that? You can see just a little bit of this through there. I want to go even further. Let's try that again. There we go. You can see how the different layers of the water become apparent. And the more shallow the water is, the more you can see through it, right? So by layering those panes, those panels, we're able to sort of fake that look a little bit. You can see it kind of nicely here, right? It looks like the water's getting deeper. You're getting a little bit of the surrounding landscape showing through in the water, which is also a realistic thing to see. So yeah, I'm liking that a lot more. See how flat this previous version looked in comparison? And it did add a bit of time. Like, so this is a 40-second rendering. And this is, not even done yet, and it's already double that amount. But still, a minute and change is not so bad. What I think I might do is make this just a bit brighter. A bit bluer and a bit brighter. It's gotten fairly dark. But yeah, that water's a lot more satisfying to my eye. All right. So, there's a lot more detailing and little bits we could add. I'm thinking about, adding more trees and like some little rock shapes. You could add different varieties of buildings and things like that. But in terms of exploring this technique, the use of this isometric camera angle and layering these landscapes and different elements and creating roads, I think we're nearing what's an acceptable stopping point, a decent little illustration here. I know we could go a lot further, like I was mentioning, but it's feeling pretty good. So I'm going to do one more pass through here and look at anything compositionally that I'm not loving. So for example, this little bump is feeling a little too close to the edge. So actually what I'm going to do is make it significantly larger so it goes all the way off the edge. I feel like you should be one or the other. Actually, now that building's a little bit too close to the edge. Let's try that. What else do we have? See this? I don't like the way that point lines up exactly with that. Back a little taller. Oops. Right. Oh. And look at how in the preview our lake has all but disappeared. All right, so I'm liking this. I'm going to make this, let's call this 1600 current frame. Cool. All right, let's knock out a rendering and bring it over to Photoshop for some quick retouching. I think we'll be able to call it a stream. Yeah, Chris, it's tough to figure out that sweet spot. I mean, the good thing about digital art is it's not like an oil painting where once you've added detail, it's a lot more tricky to pull back. So you can always do alternate versions and see which suits you best. Oh, that's something I'd recommend. Trial and error is great. And yeah, a lot of it just becomes a personal preference thing. How much detail do you really need? What's the point of the image? What are we trying to convey? Sometimes thinking about things in terms of objective and trying to remove the subjectivity from the exercise. So what do we need it for, right? What's the story we're trying to convey? If the story is that of complexity or of there being a lot of pieces or being overwhelmed or something like that, then maybe it makes sense to have something be really, really busy. But if the feeling we're trying to convey in an image is, isolation or desolation or minimalism or something like that, then maybe it would make sense to be low poly or really simple. I've seen paintings that, or even think of something like the Japanese flag. It's just like a red dot in a white field, but it works, and it doesn't get a lot simpler than that. And you look at the American flag, and it's much more complicated. Even the Brazilian flag, for example, has a lot more going on, both of which serve their purposes, and it really depends on what you're trying to do with the image. So always keep that in the back of your mind. I would say that this is feeling fairly satisfying. The image is feeling pretty good. Composition's strong enough, I think, and we've got a nice like overall lighting feel. So let's save this bad boy. I'm gonna boot up Photoshop. Let's save this bad boy out. Okay. Practice. There we go. Boom. Right. So right out of the gate, I want to bump the saturation a bit. Let's get in those curves. I mentioned that I like those bluish shadows. I'm going to get into the blue channel of the curves. I'm just going to raise the bottom end, and that just pushes more of the blue into those shadows. Right? See that? I also want to, oops. Lighten it up a hair. I always like to duplicate layers when I'm adding effects to them, or use adjustment layers and be as non-destructive as possible when inside of Photoshop. This always makes it easier if you can undo or turn down the transparency of a layer and things like that. So what I did there is added some noise and then sharpened it, right? So here's the original image. Add just a bit of noise. And when you sharpen that, the noise gets a little bit more intense, but then it pushes some contrast into the edges of areas that have contrasting values. You can see that edge becomes a little bit darker, a little bit more apparent. I don't think I want that all the way up. So the great thing about the separate, the duplicated layers is that I can just turn the opacity down on that and just crank down that effect just a hair. So what do you guys think? I'm feeling pretty good about this image. I know this is a sort of popular style. There's a lot of great artists who do work in this sort of field. I think this piece, I didn't necessarily intend it to have an effect like this, but this really has a look kind of like the work of Tim Reynolds. He does some really beautiful stuff. He's known as Turn His Left Home. Look him up. You guys probably already know about him. His work's really nice. And this is fairly low polygon. It only took 2 minutes to render a 1600 by 1600 image. So, so manageable size for sure. Pardon me. Let's see here. Yeah, Tim is great, right, Chris? Thanks, Candy. How you doing today? I didn't see you in the comments there. Thanks for swinging by again. And with that said, I think we're about to wind it down. I think I'm going to call this a finished illustration. Um, the details feel pretty good. The composition is nice. I like the color palette. We could have injected a little bit more detail. Maybe we could have made some of these buildings a little more different from each other. Some more variation within the building shapes. Maybe added a little bit of detail to these little monopoly houses. But as a 2-hour exercise, I'm feeling really good about how this came together, and I hope there was some helpful stuff for you guys to learn along the way. So yeah, it's been super fun as always. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you like what you saw, if you think this would be useful for anyone you know, please hit like, please subscribe, hit the little notification icon if you like, share it with a pal, and as always, stay on your practice. It's all about developing positive habits and enjoying the process. So, this has been another super fun episode. Sorry for being a day late. We're going to be back next Tuesday, 9 Pacific, 12 Eastern. So this is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks. See ya.